read, see what experts do,
Right.
listen to how they talk about it if you want to get good at something. Don't just practice the skill, but try to understand how people who already have the skill think about it and talk about it. Use that to make sense of what you're seeing, and then structure your practice to work on the things that they would say are important.
And today we're going to be talking about one of the 4 themes of Humanizing Work, which is growth.
And you probably picked this one because you wanted to sing.
Well, I like to, my kids pointed out to me that the Japanese word for pun is literally translated as dad joke.
I love that.
And one of my daughters actually asks me now to regularly text her, hey, what's a good dad joke, Dad? And as we were thinking about this episode, like what advice would I give about growth? My advice, of course, would be, let it grow, let it grow.
All right, where do we go from there?
Now I feel done with this episode, Richard.
Yeah,
how about you?
That's all you need to know.
Well, growth is one of the 4 themes on purpose, right? It's one of the core things that really motivates people in all aspects of their life. So I think we want to dig in a little bit on what are some of the things that we've seen, some examples of that, some research around this, and some advice.
Right. And this one really emerged as a theme in Humanizing Work for me by seeing the opposite. We see that work that doesn't provide opportunities for growth is dehumanizing.
Right.
And I think it's related to that inertia idea.
That's right.
That we talked about around motivation.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
nothing changes here. It's all the same. And I'm not motivated. And so some people go looking for growth elsewhere in their life.
Yes.
They've got hobbies or something.
Right.
But I've noticed actually a correlation between people who are growing at work seem to be more likely to be seeking out growth elsewhere in their life. People who are kind of stagnating at work seem to go home and watch TV or something and not really seek out opportunities for growth. Have you noticed anything like that?
Yeah, I think it's that energy is additive, right? And so if I'm growing at work, I've got energy, I'm energized at work. I go home and I'm not just completely exhausted. And now I've got some energy to develop other parts of my life. I'm not just, I got nothing. What's on Netflix, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start looking at individuals,
Okay.
Because it's something that you can influence directly. You can work on your own growth, and let's work our way into teams and organizations.
Okay.
So what are some things that you recommend to people to cultivate growth in their own life and work?
Yeah, I think one of the things to think about here is that I would think of 2 categories, rough categories of growth. So there's the development of a skill where I can practice playing an instrument or throwing a ball or communicating and kind of through repetition I can get better at things, right? So that's what I would refer to as kind of outer game skills, things that that just practice and practice, I get better at them. I think there's a whole other category which is around inner game, and that is how I see the world and my relationship to the world, and
How I react to things.
How I react to things would be driven by that, right? Because a lot of times the inner game is driving the way that we react to things in the world, right? And there's a lot of research in both areas, right? And so I think it would be interesting to look at the 2 categories. So a lot of my work has been focused on inner game development when I'm working with leaders. We are focusing on some of the skills, like how could I say this in a way that was more meaningful or more impactful to my team.
But you can really only use those skills when things are going well on the inside, right?
That's right. You have to be okay to do that. When you're at your best, you can do those things.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is take when we're at our worst and up what our worst is, like the lower limit. Let's move the lower limit up of when I'm at my worst.
Lets us operate out of our best more.
Yes,
right?
exactly right.
Yeah. So you've developed good communication skills, but you're stressed and flying off the handle. It doesn't matter how good you are at telling a story or coaching someone, because you're not operating out of that skill.
That's right. You're reactive at that point.
Yeah.
So there are lots of bodies of research around this. A lot of research around what we call stage development, adult stage development. There was pretty well and to this day pretty well understood research around childhood stages of development, that our kids go through distinct stages of how they view themselves and how they view the world around them and the relationship between them. That was pretty firm science by about the 40s. And it used to be, Piaget was the researcher most well known for that.
I remember learning about that in like Psych 101, GE class in college. Yeah. And then it stops.
Yeah, like his last stage was adult. Around 21 through 25, then you're an adult, and that's the last stage.
Right. So it doesn't really help us make sense of, not all adults continue growing or stop in the same place.
Right, and so there's been a lot of research around that has been really helpful for me to make sense of things. And so, we look at Claire Graves and what became spiral dynamics. We look at Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy and their work on growth of ego development and how ego development essentially meaning my sense of who I am and how I add value in the world and how I'm related to the world goes through distinct stages. And so we're starting to get some good science on this. That's really helpful to be aware of.
So can you summarize the stages for adult development?
Sure, and I'll use the Keegan one.
Yeah, I find that useful too.
I find those pretty universally useful. So the Keegan stage is essentially the kind of the last transitionary stage out of the childhood stages towards adulthood. He calls egocentric. And egocentric is something where I am driven by my own desires, my own whims, and that's how I see my place in the world, is to satisfy my own needs. And I'm aware that that impacts people around me, but that's not what drives my decision making. And in some cases, I might only be peripherally aware that that impacts other people.
And so you can stop there, right?
You could stop there, and there is a percentage of the adult population that stops there, and really the context around us is what causes us to grow. When we've kind of gotten everything that we can out of that stage, and maybe we still don't feel satisfied with life, that tends to trigger the reaching out for what else is there out there? How could I be more effective? How could I be more satisfied with my state in life? That's what tends to drive the growth from one to another. It can be crises that trigger that. It can just be dissatisfaction.
And you realize your current thing isn't working for you.
It's not working as well, right?
Yeah. Okay, so what's next?
Well, you can think of, like, to give an example of the transition, like a teenager who, gets a call from his friend, is like, hey, let's go out and do this, and they just go, and they don't tell anybody, and they don't tell anybody when they're going to be home, and they get home at 2 in the morning, and mom and dad are upset, and they're like, why are you upset? What's the problem here? I wasn't out robbing a bank or anything. I was just hanging out with my friends. They don't realize that decision impacts them. If they experience that enough, they might realize, it's not great when I come home and mom and dad are upset about these things that I thought were okay. Maybe I ought to call them. And so they experiment with that and say, hey, I'm out with my friends. I'm going to be home at such and such an hour. And they start to experiment with this other thing of being more aware of how my behavior impacts others around me. That starts to shift us into this next stage, which Keegan calls the socialized mind, which is fully caring about how other people react to what I'm doing and really getting my sense of value from how others see me.
So teenagers do that too.
Well, teenagers can go through these phases at different points as well.
Okay.
So you might have some teenagers that are well into socialized mind by the time they're 15 or 16. Anybody can go through these phases at any speed, really, right? Okay. Depending on their context and their training and their practice. And so socialized mind is I'm driven by all these things that are going on around me and how people react to it. So socialized mind is really I'm owned by the way that people react to me. Right. And Keegan makes this distinction about being subject to certain things and being able to objectify other things, look at them objectively. Whereas a teenager cannot look objectively at other people's reactions. They're subject to their whims. And then there's a shift where now I can objectively think about my whims.
It's out here.
Yeah, in the context of how that impacts other people. And the thing that people become subject to, the thing that drives me, the way Keegan says is you don't have these traits, they have you, right? Is that at the socialized mind, I am owned by other people's reactions to me and perceptions of me. That's the majority of adults are at that stage. Keegan says somewhere around 70% of adults are probably at the socialized mind stage. The next stage...
And stay there.
And stay there, yeah. The next stage beyond that is where now I can be a little bit more objective. Again, that same idea of I'm subject to it. Now I can put it out here and say, other people see me this way, but the thing I'm really driven by is the principles that I hold dearly true and important to me, right? My principles and values start to drive me. So when people make that subject-object shift, they're moving into this next stage of what he calls self-authoring mind. Because now I am the author of things. It is about what I believe to be true. Notice this is different from egocentric, where it's kind of whims and passions and desires.
Which still have you.
They still have you. Now it is I am owned by my principles. And one of the conflicts that can happen in self-authoring mind is, what if my principles are very different from yours? Then I'm still owned by mine, and I'm right and you're wrong, right? And so that is one of the downsides of a self-authoring mind. The shift that starts to happen to self-transforming mind is an awareness that my principles, I can be objective about them now. Again, this subject-object shift. I do believe these principles are dearly held. And Richard has a set of principles that he really believes are true. And I can be okay with the fact that my principles and your principles and values are different. And they're both equally valid and possibly true. It's this idea of complexity of mind, is being able to hold two seemingly opposing ideas as both possibly true in their context. So there are other stages beyond that, unitive and integral, and stages like this. We won't go into those because it's like 2-3% of the adult population. Most people are working on that shift from either egocentric to socialized mind, or socialized mind to self-authoring mind. That's where most of the power of leadership, when leadership really starts to grow, is a shift from socialized mind to self-authoring mind.
Okay, let's make this practical.
Yeah.
If you want to grow this inner game, if you want to be able to respond to the world more effectively, what do you do today?
So one of the things that we found most helpful, and that Keegan actually recommended in a talk that I heard him give, was that there is a tool that we use called the Leadership Circle. Leadership Circle is a model of leadership that there's a 360 tool associated with. It is one of the underpinnings of that model is actually this Keegan stage development between these two. And what we found is that when people get feedback from their peers that show that they're highly in this reactive socialized mind stage, it's impossible to deny. It's useful feedback rather than, that might be true, that might be their perception, versus, they got 200,000 leaders in the database and they've correlated this really directly with when I'm in socialized mind, I'm less effective. When people are in self-authoring mind, much more effective as leaders. Keegan called it a leadership development can opener, right? Because it really opens up the possibility that we can develop now, that we can grow into this other stage. Even if you're not using some kind of a 360 like that, this is a place where some practices can be very helpful. Practices like coaching, getting some coaching, and it doesn't have to be formal executive coaching to make that growth. It can be talking about this and trying to get feedback from people that we care about. The 360 formalizes that. It doesn't need to be a formal 360 in order to be effective.
So what's a question you might ask somebody in your life to get some informal coaching?
Something I might ask is, hey, when I'm at my worst, what do I look like? That's a pretty vulnerable question, right?
You need to trust that person.
You really need to trust that person and trust that they're going to respond in your best interests, right? Oh, good, now's my chance to stamp all over this person. But finding somebody that you really trust where you can be vulnerable like that is pretty critical to getting some honest feedback about how to change. It goes back to some of the things that we teach in the Agile world, right, where we need to be able to inspect and adapt. That's coming from a product and process standpoint in the Agile world. We find that that's true personally as well for growth, is I need some feedback so that I can inspect my own behavior, my own beliefs, and then adapt them to be more fulfilled, more effective in my life.
I've noticed an interesting pattern with the leadership circle in the people that I've talked about it with or coached that just occurred to me right now. I was reflecting on the way the 360 makes a huge difference for some people. For others, explaining the model is sufficient. And as you were talking about the stages of development, it occurred to me that if you're already well into the self-authoring stage, enough of your personality and your reactions are object to you that just getting words for it is enough for you to start working on it. Like I think about my wife when we talk through the leadership circle, she hasn't done the 360, but she was able to immediately say, here's how I react, here's where that comes from in my life, let me make a plan to start working on it. And it was like everything we would do with a month of feedback and a coaching session, she did it in the hour we were talking about the model. Right.
Because she already had the self-awareness that comes from being at that next stage of development, right?
Yeah, so it seems like the formal tool is really useful to go from socialized to self-authoring. If you're well into self-authoring and continuing to develop, just having a model for it, maybe even using the self-assessment on the Leadership Circle website may be enough to kickstart that growth today.
I think that's true in a lot of areas of growth. So if I think of my background, so my training, my early career was all in music, and I remember the first time I read a music theory book. Now, to a lot of students, music theory is like, oh, music theory.
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah, and when I read it, I was like, oh, that's why all that stuff works. Because, you know, I had an intuitive sense, a talent for hearing and reproducing music and writing it down. When I learned about music theory, it was like, oh, okay, now I have language to talk about the things that I already intuitively understood. So I think that that's true of a lot of growth. And so another kind of tip or trick is that if you want to grow, read and listen to audiobooks and study, and you know, just getting language for things from people that have researched these things can be super helpful. Even if you feel like, I have a natural skill for that. Reading about that area, it can give you language that can really help you kind of supercharge it.
This is a nice shift into how do you develop the other kinds of skills, right? The outer ones, because that's something I've read a lot about, paid a lot of attention to.
Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to guess that you're going to go towards kind of deliberate practice?
Well,
or maybe not.
I am and I'm not.
Okay.
So I'm going to go towards Anders Ericsson, the father of deliberate practice. Yeah. But what made me think of it was the last thing you were talking about, where reading, getting a model for something, can accelerate your performance. And so Anders Ericsson spent most of his career looking at practice. Yeah. You know, the 10,000 hours of practice thing you see in Malcolm Gladwell's writing is a oversimplification of some early work.
And small subset of the factors that actually made those people masters at looking.
The source is good, but that's real small. Yeah. So if you read Ericsson's own work, you get a lot more about deliberate practice, and maybe we'll link to some of that in the show notes. But an interesting shift happened more recently in Ericsson's work, where he wanted to look at what's going on in the minds of experts, and did some studies that showed really clearly experts have richer mental models for whatever domain they have expertise in. Yeah. You know, master chess players see something different when they look at a chessboard than even a competent intermediate player does. Yes. Which sort of makes sense. I remember looking at your last Jazz and Agile session at Agile, Arizona, and the keyboard player talking about like how he was thinking about some of the changes or how you might arrange it. He had a much richer mental model than probably most people in the room for arrangement.
Which is why music theory was helpful to me. I had a different mental model, a richer mental model for what's going on in these feelings I'm having as I listen to music.
So Ericsson discovered that experts get these richer mental models through lots of practice, but the thing he wanted to test out was, could you accelerate the practice with the expert's mental model? Can you flip it around and short circuit it? And they found you can. Nice. So if you understand how experts think about things, and this is kind of what's going on with music theory, if you understand why it works, now you can go back and target your practice around using some of those things that work, building your own model and your own skills faster. So I think I would echo your recommendation to read, see what experts do, listen to how they talk about it. If you want to get good at something, don't just practice the skill, but try to understand how people who already have the skill think about it and talk about it. Use that to make sense of what you're seeing, and then structure your practice to work on the things that they would say are important.
Well, it makes me think of another tool that we can use for individual growth, which is finding a mentor, right? And a mentor is often playing that role of suggesting and introducing people to richer mental models for the thing that they're trying to grow in. And so having somebody that you can look up to that is really a mentor that's been there, that has those richer mental models, that can help you see where maybe you're missing the point, or see where you see the world this way, they see it a little bit differently, and just that insight into, that's something I'd never thought about before, can really unlock some growth for people.
And then once you decide to practice something, practice is not what many people expect it to be.
Well, there's the old phrase that practice makes perfect, right? And as a musician, I used to hear that all the time. And then somebody said, no, perfect practice makes perfect. And then somebody else said, no, practice makes permanent.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Whatever you do a lot becomes easier to do. Becomes more automatic for you. And the research on practice shows you need to be practicing right at the edge of what you can do. It needs to be a little bit too hard for you. There's a great book that I recommend to all the musicians I work with called First Learn to Practice.
First Learn to Practice.
First Learn to Practice, which is like a 100-page book about how do you practice. And there's a great distinction in there between practice and play and learning, and like there's several different things you could do in a practice session in a musical context.
Right.
And I've found this useful in other contexts too, where if you're just playing a song that you already know, you're not really practicing.
There's no growth there.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're focusing on some piece of it you can't quite get right in some way, and you're focusing on the mechanics with your fingers or your lips if you're playing trumpet or whatever it is, then you are practicing. That's something different, and that's where the real growth is happening.
Well, and I notice that when I'm practicing something, I use similar tools that we use in a lot of our coaching, which is I try and narrow the scope of what I'm trying to improve. So in that example you gave, where for a musical example, I'm trying to get better at playing this really difficult passage that I can't quite seem to get right. What I'll do is I'll narrow the variables. I'll say, well, let me remove the variable of speed and slow it way down and practice it so that I can play it perfectly at a slow speed. Or I'll remove the barrier of needing the fingering to be right, and I'll just get the articulation correct. Let me practice the articulation. So focus on one variable at a time, and I think that that's broadly applicable as well. If you think of leaders trying to communicate better or trying to coach better, narrow it down to I'm just going to focus on listening and holding back on my advice giving so that I can be a better coach. Or I'm just going to focus on the questions that I ask in a conversation. I'm just going to ask what we call open access or powerful questions, questions that lead people to insight versus yes or no questions. Right. Narrowing to a single thing and really practicing that and just doing a skill drill on that one thing is what leads to growth in an area like that.
And drill's an important word there.
Yes.
Drill is short repetition with immediate feedback.
Right.
And so if you wanted to improve your questioning skills,
right.
Rather than just hoping opportunities come up, I would say think about a situation you're in and come up with 5 different ways you might have asked a question at that point, and evaluate them and think about it, and start watching for those opportunities.
Or you've got a one-on-one meeting coming up with somebody. What do you expect to come up in that meeting? What are 5 questions you might be able to ask that might point things in different direction and add additional insight?
Yeah. Right. So that's individual growth. Let's real quick talk about larger groups, teams and organizations. If we want to see growth at that area, is it just all the individuals decide to grow, or is there something more that happens with a group system?
And I think there is something magical when we put people together, and this goes into the collaboration theme a little bit. So now we're talking about individual growth and wrapping that with collaboration. How do we collaborate better together? I was just thinking about an example. I was listening to an interview, or it was actually more of a debate kind of style podcast between Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hour popularizer, right, and Adam Grant. And they were talking about, Grant was telling a story about, he had given a keynote at Google, and they asked him, if you were made CEO of Google, what's the one policy or process you would change here? And his response was really interesting to me. He said, what I would change is you hire individuals and you promote individuals, despite the clear evidence that the thing that matters is teams. And so my recommendation, the thing I would change is, instead of hiring individuals, I would hire teams that are high-performing teams.
What does that even mean?
And I would promote teams. And because it's hard to grasp, like how do you hire a team? But you know, the key point there is that the focus is on the team, not the individual. Right? That's the unit that we care about and that we measure and that we promote. And he even said that. He said, I would promote teams, not individuals. And you know, Google, they took that in an interesting way. They didn't do that. They didn't take his advice. What they did do is they started studying their best teams to see what principles were true and how we might be able to make all teams great, which is, you know, a different take on it. His point, though, was that the deliberate practice and individual growth matters, but not nearly as much as the strength of collaboration on a team. And he used an example of studying surgeons. And you might expect that a surgeon to perform a certain type of surgery with deliberate practice would get better and better and better at it, and they found that's not the case at all. So a lot of surgeons go from hospital to hospital and perform surgeries, the same type of surgery at different hospitals. So you expect that over time their success rate of that surgery would get better as they practice it deliberately. What they found was the only factor that mattered is what team were they performing the surgery with. So the surgery team mattered much more than the individual's skill. So there's something about collaboration and the way that people work together that is almost more important. Now, a team of people that are individually growing and working on their skills, that also collaborates well. I'd much rather have that team than a team that collaborates well that doesn't have individual skill. But to take the other side of that, I would much rather have a high collaborating team versus a low collaborating team that does have individual greatness on it.
Right.
That's going to be more effective.
So I think that same outer-inner distinction works with teams. You can set goals for these things. You can do deliberate practice. You can increase your awareness by reading about what other teams do.
Right.
And something like Scrum gives us that retrospective every sprint to say, where do we want to grow? What do we want to focus on?
Yeah.
And I see some teams waste that and say, we need somebody else to fix a thing for us.
Right.
Rather than, this is an opportunity for us to grow in some way
Yeah.
and have a bigger impact, make the work easier.
Yeah, and it's, when we think about like a retrospective, which is a practice from Scrum, where pretty regularly, every couple of weeks, the teams gets together and says, what can we improve? A lot of times the improvements will be about tools, or they'll be about how we interact with other parts of the organization. There's not a high focus on, can we improve the way that we collaborate as a team? That's, I think, where the real magic of a retrospective can happen.
So that's a practical question people can take into their next retrospective.
Right.
Like, rather than how can we make our tools better in some way, how can we make ourselves as a team
As a
better
collaborating team,
in some way?
And so really what we're talking about then is the skills of collaboration. And some of the things that we know from the research around teams, I usually cite one of three sources when I'm talking about teams. I either talk about Lencioni and the 5 dysfunctions, which I think is a really useful, he describes kind of a pyramid, which we'll put in the show notes, right? But it starts with trust. Do we trust each other? Can I say things that feel uncomfortable? A little bit when we were talking about individual growth. Can I be vulnerable here, right? As a building block for everything else, and then it builds up from there, right?
So maybe that's another episode of
it could be, like an episode around teams would be interesting, right? I also talk about J. Richard Hackman, who was a researcher on teams from Harvard, and he studied teams outside of the business context, and similar principles though. And then also the Google research is interesting. In some ways it's a reframing of a lot of the things that we already know, but because it's so practical and because it's so well known, it can be really useful to look at Google's research on that. Interestingly enough, their foundational principle was psychological safety, very similar to trust and vulnerability, right? So we've covered a lot of things around individual growth, a lot of things around team growth. I think in the interest of time, what we should do is maybe have a future episode on organizational growth, because that really can be its own topic. There's some really great research, actually by the same person, by Keegan and people, right. Kagan and Leahy, around organizational growth. But I think we have some pretty, action-packed ideas for what we can do at the individual and team level. If you were to give like one piece of advice around this, if you were to summarize it, how would you summarize the advice?
Pay attention to growth. We recommend to many of our clients an awareness assignment first. Just look at what's happening, look at where you would benefit from more growth. And then you asked for one, I'm going to give you two, which is, as you identify one, get somebody to help you think about making a plan for that.
It's interesting, even
coaching, mentoring.
Right, even individually we benefit through collaboration, even if it's just a pair, right? Yeah. Good.
We'd like to hear from you. Where are you hoping to grow? Where are you trying to grow? Whether it's the individual outer game kind of skills or inner game kind of growth, or where are you trying to grow as a team? And maybe we can go deeper into some strategies to grow in some of these areas in a future episode. So reply in the comments below and let us know where you're trying to grow. As always, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a future episode.